No one in that mansion realized the quietest person in the room would change everything. Inside a glass-walled estate overlooking the Upper East Side skyline of New York City, the Coleman residence was hosting an evening that was supposed to represent perfection, the kind of night where crystal glasses, polished silverware, and carefully chosen words created the illusion of control. Yet something subtle was already falling apart beneath the surface. At the center of it all sat Evelyn Coleman, the elderly mother of billionaire Richard Coleman, positioned at the head of a long dining table that stretched like a symbol of distance rather than connection. Evelyn was deaf, having lost her hearing early in life. And though she had spent decades mastering lip reading and reading human expression, tonight the room felt unusually fast, fragmented, and unkind in its pace. Conversations overlapped, heads turned away mid-sentence, and laughter arrived without translation, leaving her isolated in a space filled with people who believed they were including her. Richard Coleman, standing near a marble fireplace in a tailored navy suit, carried the weight of his company and reputation on his shoulders, greeting guests with practiced ease while frequently glancing toward his mother with a distracted concern he never had enough time to fully act upon. Outside the mansion, a black SUV rolled through the curved driveway, tires gliding over polished stone, and came to a stop beneath the soft glow of exterior lights. Maria Carter stepped out first, adjusting her modest coat against the evening air, followed by her daughter Emily Carter, who held a small backpack tightly as she looked up at the towering structure in front of her. Maria had been brought in temporarily as part of the household staff during renovations, and she had no choice but to bring Emily with her that night, trusting she would stay quiet and out of the way. As they entered through the grand foyer, where marble floors reflected chandelier light like liquid glass, Emily slowed instinctively, her eyes scanning the overwhelming scale of wealth surrounding her. Yet what struck her most was not the luxury, but the silence hidden inside it, a silence that felt heavier than noise. From deeper inside the house, Emily heard nothing unusual, but she saw something that made her pause. Evelyn Coleman at the dining table, her hand resting firmly against the polished wood as she attempted once again to communicate something important. A young assistant leaned forward, speaking slowly and overly clearly as if speaking to a child. But Evelyn's expression tightened with quiet frustration, her hands responding in structured, deliberate motion that no one seemed to interpret correctly. Emily's gaze locked onto those movements instantly. They were not random gestures, not confusion, but language, precise and meaningful, shaped by emotion and intent. Maria gently touched her daughter's arm and urged her to follow, but Emily did not respond. Instead, she studied Evelyn's hands more closely, noticing the rhythm, the pauses, the subtle shifts that carried meaning far deeper than spoken words. Something in her memory stirred, fragments of old practice, hours spent in front of a mirror years ago learning sign language from videos she had once found out of curiosity and never fully forgotten. The mansion around her continued its quiet chaos, glasses clinking softly, voices overlapping like distant waves, but Emily felt herself pulled toward a different current entirely. Evelyn glanced up again, repeating emotion slower this time, her expression carrying a loneliness that no amount of wealth could hide. And in that exact moment, Emily took a single step forward, not because she was invited, not because she was expected, but because she understood something no one else in that room had even noticed yet. And that understanding was about to shift the balance of everything inside the Coleman household in a way no one could have predicted. Emily Carter did not realize that the moment she took that step forward, the entire atmosphere inside the Coleman mansion had already begun to shift in ways no one in the room could yet understand. The dining area remained filled with controlled noise, the soft clinking of glassware, the low hum of conversation, and the distant rhythm of a grand piano playing automatically from a speaker system hidden within the walls. Yet Emily felt none of it as she focused entirely on the elderly woman at the head of the table. Evelyn Coleman noticed her almost immediately, not because of sound, but because of intention, because in a room full of people who constantly looked past her, someone had finally chosen to look directly at her without hesitation. Evelyn's hands lifted again, slower this time, forming deliberate shapes that carried urgency and frustration, as if she had been repeating the same message for far too long without being understood. One of the household assistants leaned in again, attempting to interpret with limited familiarity, but his guess was wrong, and Evelyn's expression tightened slightly in disappointment. Emily stepped closer before anyone could stop her, her backpack still hanging loosely from one shoulder, her presence quiet but increasingly noticeable. Maria Carter, standing near the entrance of the dining hall, felt a sudden unease and tried to call softly to her daughter, but the sound never reached Emily in a way that mattered anymore. Emily's attention was fully locked onto Evelyn's hands, and as she watched carefully, she began to respond, her own hands rising into view with a cautious but confident motion. At first, the room did not understand what was happening. Conversations did not stop, but they slowed slightly, like a background process being interrupted by something unexpected. Evelyn paused mid-gesture, her eyes narrowing with curiosity as she studied Emily's response. Emily repeated the movement more clearly, adjusting her position, aligning her posture, and then signing back with precision that came not from formal training alone, but from long-forgotten practice and instinct. Evelyn's hands moved again, this time faster, as if asking a question she had been waiting a long time to ask, and Emily answered without hesitation, her gestures flowing more smoothly now, as though a locked door had suddenly opened in her memory. Could ignore, as even the most distracted guests gradually fell silent, sensing that they were witnessing something unusual and deeply personal. Evelyn's hands moved with increasing clarity, her gestures no longer hesitant but purposeful, as if a long-restrained voice was finally finding its natural rhythm. Emily responded without delay, her own movements steady and precise, reflecting not only understanding but emotional awareness that went beyond simple translation. Richard Coleman had moved closer now, standing several feet behind Emily, his expression tightening with growing disbelief as he watched his mother communicate with a level of fluency she had not shown in years, at least not in any setting he had ever observed. Evelyn paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on Emily, and then signed a sequence of gestures that seemed more complex, layered with meaning that suggested memory and recognition rather than casual conversation. Emily hesitated briefly, her brow furrowing slightly as she processed the depth of what was being said. Then she responded in kind, her hands moving more carefully now, as though confirming something delicate and important. A soft murmur began to spread among the guests, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to reveal their confusion and growing curiosity, yet no one stepped forward to interrupt what was happening. Maria Carter stood near the entrance of the dining hall, her hands clasped together tightly, watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern, unable to understand how Emily had developed such a skill without ever mentioning it at home. Evelyn's expression changed again, this time softening into something almost vulnerable, and she signed more slowly, her movements smaller but filled with emotion that caused even those who could not understand the language to feel its weight. Emily's response was immediate but gentle, her gestures carrying reassurance, as if she were not simply interpreting words but restoring something that had been missing for a very long time. Richard Coleman finally stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the interaction, his voice caught in his throat as he attempted to speak. But no sound came out at first, because what he was witnessing did not fit into the structure of his expectations. Evelyn turned slightly, acknowledging her son's presence without breaking the flow of communication with Emily. And for the first time that evening, Richard saw something in his mother's face that he had not seen in years, a sense of being understood without struggle. Emily continued signing, her hands now moving with quiet confidence, and Evelyn responded with increasing ease, as though the barrier that had defined her entire life within this household was dissolving in real time. The room remained frozen in attention, chandeliers casting steady light over faces that were now fully focused on a conversation they could not hear but could unmistakably feel. Richard's eyes shifted between Emily and his mother, searching for explanation, but what he found instead was realization, a slow and uncomfortable understanding that communication had been happening in his own home for years in a way he had never learned to see. Evelyn signed something longer this time, her expression carrying a mixture of relief and disbelief, and Emily responded with equal depth, her movements reflecting not only understanding but a sense of connection that seemed to bridge far more than language alone. As the exchange continued, the distance between status, wealth, and background felt less significant than it had ever been. And in the center of the room stood a child of a household worker who had unintentionally become the only voice Evelyn Coleman could fully rely on in that moment, shifting the emotional balance of the entire mansion in a way that would soon force everyone present to reconsider what they believed about value, capability, and the unseen strengths that often go unnoticed. Unmistakable in the slight shift of her posture, a subtle acknowledgement without breaking the flow of communication she had finally regained. Emily Carter adjusted her stance slightly, maintaining eye contact with Evelyn while also sensing the weight of attention now directed at her from one of the most powerful figures in the room. Richard's expression was controlled, but beneath it was a clear strain of confusion and disbelief, as though he were trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he believed about his household and the people within it. He glanced briefly at the assistant who had previously attempted translation, but the assistant only shook his head slightly, indicating that he could no longer follow the depth of the exchange. Evelyn signed again, slower this time, her hands forming deliberate shapes that carried emotional weight, and Emily responded in a way that was not only accurate, but deeply attentive, as if she understood not just the language but the intent behind it. Richard finally raised his voice, carefully at first, asking a question directed toward Emily, but Evelyn immediately lifted one hand in a firm yet calm motion, signaling without sound that the conversation was not to be interrupted. The gesture alone shifted the dynamic in the room, because it was the first time anyone in the household had seen Evelyn assert control over an interaction so clearly and so confidently. Richard fell silent, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched Emily continue without hesitation, her hands moving fluidly as she responded to something his mother had just expressed. A quiet tension settled over the guests, who now understood they were no longer observing a simple interaction, but something far more significant unfolding in real time. Evelyn's expression softened further, and she signed a sequence that appeared longer and more personal, causing Emily to pause for a fraction of a second before replying with equal care, her movements slower now, as though choosing each response with precision. Maria Carter, still standing near the entrance, felt her chest tighten as she watched her daughter operate in a space she had never seen her inhabit before, surrounded by wealth and silence that no longer felt intimidating to her. Richard took a step closer again, this time more cautiously, his attention shifting between Emily and his mother, searching for the origin of this unexpected connection. Evelyn finally turned her gaze slightly toward him, not breaking her exchange with Emily entirely, and signed something that caused Richard's expression to change, his brows drawing together as if he had just been confronted with a realization he was not prepared for. Emily responded to Evelyn's final gesture with a calm certainty that seemed to settle something within the older woman, and for a brief moment Evelyn closed her eyes, her hands lowering slightly, as if relieved from a burden she had carried for years. The room remained completely still, with every guest now fully aware that something irreversible had taken place within the Coleman household, not in the form of conflict or disruption, but in the form of understanding that no one had been able to provide until now. Richard's voice lowered as he spoke again, this time not demanding but asking for clarity, yet Evelyn only raised her hand gently once more, indicating that the explanation he sought was not something that could be delivered in words he would hear, but in the connection he was now witnessing in front of him. Emily continued signing, her expression composed but deeply engaged, and Evelyn responded with a subtle nod that carried more meaning than any spoken sentence in the room, while Richard stood in silence, beginning to realize that what he had always considered his household had contained a truth far more complex and far more human than he had ever taken the time to understand. The silence inside the Coleman mansion grew heavier as the exchange between Evelyn Coleman and Emily Carter continued, but now it was no longer just observation. It had become scrutiny, as every person in the room tried to understand what role they were witnessing being rewritten in real time. Richard Coleman remained standing near the center of the dining hall, his posture controlled yet visibly tense, as he watched his mother continue to communicate with Emily in a way that felt more natural and more emotionally complete than anything he had seen in years. Evelyn's hands moved with steady intention, and for the first time, There was no hesitation in her expression, only clarity and a quiet sense of relief, as if the act of being understood had restored something that had long been missing from her life. Emily responded without delay, her focus unwavering, her gestures careful but increasingly confident, reflecting not just comprehension but a growing emotional alignment with Evelyn that extended beyond language itself. Richard finally attempted again to intervene, his voice slightly firmer as he asked what exactly Emily was saying, but Evelyn did not turn toward him immediately, instead maintaining her attention on Emily as she completed her thought. Only after a pause did Evelyn sign something short and firm in Richard's direction, a gesture that carried both acknowledgement and a boundary, indicating that he was not yet part of this specific conversation. That moment landed heavily, because it was not anger or rejection, but something more unsettling for Richard, the realization that his presence was secondary in a space he had always assumed he controlled. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances as the power dynamic in the room became increasingly unclear, while Maria Carter stood quietly near the doorway, her eyes fixed on her daughter with a mixture of disbelief and quiet pride that she could not express aloud. Evelyn then turned back fully to Emily, and what followed was a longer sequence of signing, slower and more deliberate than before, as if she were explaining something deeply personal or long unspoken. Emily's expression changed subtly as she watched, her hands slowing as she processed the meaning. Then she responded with careful precision, her movements softer now, carrying emotional nuance that made several observers instinctively lower their gaze, as if they were intruding on something private. Richard stepped forward another half step, his attention narrowing, and this time he did not speak immediately, instead watching closely as Emily and Evelyn reached a rhythm that felt practiced. Despite being newly revealed to him, Evelyn's face showed something rare, a faint expression of ease, as if the burden of constant miscommunication had temporarily lifted, and she signed again, this time with a slight upward motion that suggested reassurance. Emily nodded slightly before responding, her hands steady, and in that exchange Richard began to notice something he had previously overlooked, which was not just Emily's ability, but Evelyn's responsiveness, as though she had been waiting for someone capable enough to meet her at her level for a very long time. A guest near the far end of the table quietly set down a glass, the sound small but noticeable in the stillness, yet no one reacted, because attention remained fixed on the unfolding communication. Richard finally spoke again, but his tone had changed, less authoritative and more uncertain, as he asked his mother if she knew Emily prior to this moment. Evelyn paused briefly, her eyes shifting toward her son for the first time in several minutes, and she signed a short response that made Richard's expression tighten as he tried to interpret it without assistance. Emily observed the exchange without interrupting, her posture calm, as if she understood the sensitivity of what was being discussed. After a brief pause, Evelyn returned her attention to Emily and continued, but the emotional tone of her signing had shifted, becoming more reflective, and Emily responded with equal care, her movements slightly slower, as if confirming something that carried deeper significance than the current moment alone. Richard stood still, processing not only what was being communicated but also the fact that he had never been included in this layer of his mother's life. And as that realization settled in, the room around him felt less like a place of control and more like a space where something long hidden had finally begun to surface. The tension inside the Coleman mansion reached a new level of quiet intensity as Evelyn Coleman and Emily Carter continued their exchange, now moving with a depth that made it increasingly clear this was not a simple conversation, but something far more layered and personal. Richard Coleman stood still near the edge of the dining area, his earlier attempts to assert control over the situation fading into hesitation as he observed how naturally Emily responded to his mother's gestures, as if she had entered a space that no one else in the household had ever been allowed to access. Evelyn's hands moved in a slower rhythm again, and her expression carried a softness that had not been present earlier in the evening, suggesting a shift from explanation to recognition, as though she was confirming something she had been uncertain about for a long time. Emily listened carefully with her eyes, then responded with measured precision, her hands forming responses that carried both clarity and emotional sensitivity, and the surrounding guests remained silent, sensing that even small interruptions would feel inappropriate in that moment. Richard finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, asking his mother directly if Emily had been part of her life before this evening. But Evelyn did not respond immediately, instead maintaining her focus on Emily for a few more seconds, as if ensuring the message had been fully expressed and understood. When she finally turned toward Richard, her hands moved in a brief sequence that made his expression tighten further, because whatever she had communicated was not simple reassurance, but something that challenged his understanding of recent events. Emily remained composed, observing without interfering, and then Evelyn turned back toward her once more, continuing the exchange with a level of familiarity that now seemed to extend beyond coincidence or chance. There was a moment where Evelyn's face shifted into a faint, almost fragile expression, and she signed something that caused Emily to pause longer than before, her hands hovering briefly as she processed the meaning with visible care. When Emily finally responded, her movements were slower and more deliberate, and the emotional weight in the room deepened as several guests instinctively lowered their gaze, no longer fully comfortable watching something so personal unfold in such a public setting. Maria Carter remained near the entrance, her hands now loosely clasped, her attention fixed on her daughter as she tried to understand how Emily had developed such fluency without ever mentioning it in detail at home. Yet what struck her most was not only the skill itself, but the confidence with which Emily carried it in a space defined by wealth and authority. Richard took a cautious step forward again, but this time there was no attempt to interrupt, only a growing need to understand the connection forming in front of him. Evelyn's gestures became slightly more animated again, as if she were clarifying a memory or correcting a misunderstanding, and Emily responded with immediate understanding, her expression steady but increasingly thoughtful, as though she was piecing together context that extended beyond the present moment. The assistant who had previously attempted to interpret the conversation stood further back now, clearly aware that his role had been replaced entirely by something far more accurate and natural. Richard's eyes moved between his mother and Emily, and for the first time he began to notice not just what was being communicated, but the ease with which it was happening, as if a barrier that had defined their household for years had simply not existed for Emily. Evelyn finally paused her hands for a brief moment, her gaze shifting toward Richard, and when she signed this time it was shorter, but it carried a weight that caused him to go completely silent. Emily did not look at him directly, instead maintaining focus on Evelyn, as if respecting the flow of their exchange, and then Evelyn continued, her hands slower now, her expression calm but reflective. In that steady rhythm, something subtle but irreversible solidified in the room, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet restructuring of relationships, where understanding was no longer dependent on status or assumption, but on the simple presence of someone willing and able to bridge a silence that had existed for far too long within the Coleman household. The dining hall of the Coleman mansion remained completely still, but the silence inside it had changed in quality, becoming less like confusion and more like anticipation, as if everyone present now understood they were witnessing a moment that would not simply pass without consequence. Evelyn Coleman's hands slowed again, and this time her expression carried a depth of reflection that suggested she was no longer just communicating present thoughts, but revisiting something long held within memory. Emily Carter responded with equal care, her gestures steady and precise, but there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor now, a quiet awareness that the conversation had moved into something more personal and possibly more significant than she had initially expected. Richard Coleman stood several feet away, no longer attempting to insert himself into the exchange, but still unable to step away, his attention fully captured by the rhythm between his mother and Emily, a rhythm that felt increasingly natural and uninterrupted. Evelyn paused briefly, then signed something that caused Emily to still her hands for a moment longer than before, her expression tightening slightly as she processed the meaning. When Emily responded, her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if carefully confirming the weight of what had been conveyed, and the emotional atmosphere in the room deepened further. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, not out of fear but out of the sense that they were intruding on something deeply private, yet none of them looked away. Maria Carter's gaze remained fixed on her daughter, her pride now mixed with confusion and a growing realization that Emily had been carrying something within her that she had never fully shared. Evelyn's expression softened again, and she signed in a way that appeared almost explanatory, as though she were filling in gaps that had existed for a long time, and Emily nodded slightly before responding with careful clarity. Richard finally exhaled slowly, his posture less rigid than before, but his mind visibly unsettled as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he knew about his household. Evelyn turned her head slightly toward him, acknowledging his presence without fully breaking her exchange with Emily, and signed a brief sequence that made him pause, his eyes narrowing as he attempted to interpret without assistance. Emily continued to focus entirely on Evelyn, maintaining the flow of communication with an ease that now felt undeniable. And for the first time, Richard began to understand that what he was witnessing was not a rare coincidence, but a capability that had been consistently present in front of him without recognition. Evelyn's hands moved once more, slower now, and her expression carried something close to relief, as if she had finally found a reliable connection after years of frustration and isolation. Emily responded gently, her movements reflecting understanding not only of language, but of emotional context, and that distinction became increasingly clear to everyone watching. The assistant who had once tried to mediate the conversation now stood entirely aside, his earlier attempts rendered irrelevant by the natural fluency unfolding between them. Richard took a small step forward again, but stopped short of interrupting, instead watching as his mother and Emily reached a level of communication that felt both effortless and profound. Evelyn's final gesture in this sequence was smaller, almost subtle, yet it caused Emily to pause and then respond with a calm, steady motion that seemed to settle something unspoken between them. The room remained frozen in attention, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present, as the unspoken boundaries of wealth, status, and familiarity were quietly redefined by a simple truth that had been overlooked for far too long, that understanding had always been possible within this household, but only now had someone finally made it real. The final exchange between Evelyn Coleman and Emily Carter carried a different energy now, one that no longer felt like uncertainty or discovery, but instead resembled a quiet sense of resolution forming in real time within the grand dining hall. Evelyn's hands moved with slower, more settled gestures, and her expression reflected something closer to emotional release than continued explanation, as if she had finally expressed thoughts that had been held back for far too long. Emily responded with equal calm, her movements steady and respectful, but there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor as well, as though she now fully understood the emotional weight behind everything that had been communicated up to this point. Richard Coleman stood in place, no longer attempting to analyze every movement, but instead absorbing the overall reality of what he was witnessing, which was that his mother had achieved a level of communication and emotional connection he had never been able to provide for her within the structure of his own life. Evelyn briefly turned her attention toward Richard again, and this time her gesture was softer, less about exclusion and more about acknowledgement, as if she were signaling that what had just occurred was not meant to distance him, but to reveal something he had not yet seen. Emily followed Evelyn's gaze for a moment, then returned her focus, maintaining a respectful boundary while still continuing the conversation that seemed to anchor Evelyn's emotional state. The guests in the room remained almost entirely silent now, the earlier curiosity replaced by a subdued awareness that they were observing something deeply human rather than simply unusual. Maria Carter's eyes remained fixed on her daughter, her expression now blending quiet disbelief with a growing understanding that Emily's ability was not accidental but deeply rooted in something she had never fully explored or explained at home. Evelyn signed one final extended sequence, slower than before, and Emily responded with careful precision, her hands moving in a way that suggested confirmation rather than new information, as if both of them were concluding an understanding that had been building throughout the entire interaction. Richard exhaled slowly again, his posture loosening slightly, but his face reflected a complex mixture of realization and internal conflict, because what he had witnessed was not just communication, but the restructuring of relationships within his own household without his direct involvement or control. Evelyn lowered her hands gradually, her expression settling into calmness. And for the first time that evening, she looked fully at ease, as if the weight of constant misunderstanding had been temporarily lifted from her shoulders. Emily mirrored that calmness, stepping back just slightly, not out of withdrawal but out of respect for the space she had helped open. Richard finally took a step forward, not to interrupt, but to stand closer to what had just occurred, and as he did, Evelyn turned toward him more fully, her expression neutral but no longer distant, signaling that the moment of communication had not ended but had simply changed form. Emily remained quietly present, her attention shifting subtly between both of them, as the room around them continued to hold its silence, now filled not with confusion or shock, but with the undeniable recognition that something foundational within the Coleman household had shifted permanently, replacing long-standing silence with the possibility of understanding that no one present could ignore anymore. The final moments inside the Coleman mansion carried a stillness that felt different from everything that had come before, no longer filled with tension or uncertainty, but instead shaped by a quiet recognition that something irreversible had already taken place. Evelyn Coleman remained seated at the head of the long dining table, her posture relaxed in a way that had not been seen earlier in the evening, her hands now resting calmly, as if she no longer needed to search for words through motion. Emily Carter stood a short distance away, no longer actively signing, but maintaining a respectful presence that reflected both understanding and restraint, as though she knew her role in this moment had shifted from participant to observer. Richard Coleman remained near them, his expression no longer driven by confusion alone, but by a deeper awareness that what he had just witnessed was not an isolated event, but a reflection of something long absent within his family life. Evelyn slowly turned her attention fully toward Richard, and though she did not immediately raise her hands again, her expression carried a clarity that suggested she was now communicating without urgency, as if the emotional barrier that had existed for so long had already been addressed. After a brief pause, she signed a final short sequence, not directed at explanation but at acknowledgement, and Richard watched carefully, no longer attempting to interrupt or interpret in haste, instead allowing himself to simply observe. Emily glanced between them briefly, then lowered her gaze slightly, stepping back another small distance, signaling that the exchange was now returning to the family itself. Maria Carter remained near the entrance, still quiet, her eyes moving between her daughter and the scene before her, absorbing the weight of what had unfolded and beginning to understand that Emily's ability had placed her in a position far beyond what she had ever expected. Evelyn's expression softened further as she looked at Emily once more, and there was a subtle gesture of gratitude in her final movement, a calm and simple acknowledgement that needed no further elaboration. Emily responded with a slight nod, her expression steady, and then allowed her hands to rest fully at her sides, indicating the end of the active communication. Richard finally spoke, but his voice was no longer filled with authority or confusion, instead carrying a quieter tone of realization as he acknowledged what he had witnessed, though Evelyn did not respond immediately with further signing, choosing instead to maintain eye contact, reinforcing the understanding that had already been established. The guests in the room remained silent, no longer as observers of an unusual interaction, but as witnesses to a shift in the foundation of the household dynamic, where hierarchy and assumption had been momentarily suspended by something far simpler and far more human. Emily took one final step back toward her mother, not in withdrawal but in completion of her role within the moment, and Maria gently placed a hand on her shoulder, still processing the depth of what had just occurred. Evelyn finally lowered her gaze slightly, her expression calm and composed, and Richard stood beside her in quiet reflection, no longer trying to interpret everything at once, but beginning to recognize the reality that had been overlooked for years within his own home, that understanding had always been possible, and that it had finally arrived through a voice he had never thought to listen to until this very night.